War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 78, the Battle of Poltava. In morning 27 of June 1709, the steppe around the Ukrainian town of Poltava was still and heavy because two armies were about to go to war. In the east, the Dnieper River glimmered faintly, while to the west, the plains stretched towards the encampment of the Swedish army. Once Europe's most feared military machine, now not so much after trying to fight in Russia. For almost a decade, King Charles XII of Sweden had seemed invincible. His highly disciplined soldiers sweeping through Poland, Saxony, and Denmark with complete precision. Yet here, on the outskirts of this little fortified town, the tide of what was known as the Great Northern War was about to finally turn against him. The story of Poltava began years before, when the Great Northern War erupted in 1700. Sweden stood at the height of its imperial power. The Baltic was essentially a Swedish lake, its shores studded with fortresses and ports completely under Stockholm's control. But the young Tsar Peter Romanov of Russia, newly ambitious for his backward kingdom, sought to break Sweden's dominance and gain access to the sea. He joined with Denmark, Norway, and Saxony/Poland in an alliance to crush Sweden and seize its Baltic possessions. What followed was a war that would reshape Eastern and Northern Europe. Charles XII was only 18 when this war began, but he did quite well. He smashed Denmark in a matter of weeks, humiliated the Saxons and the Poland, and then he turned his attention to Russia. In 1708, with his veterans hardened by years of fighting, he launched an invasion into Russian territory, and his aim was to crush this new Peter's army and, of course, capture Moscow. Yeah, we heard this story before. But the Tsar avoided open battle, and instead he did what good Russians do in circumstances such as this. He ordered the scorched earth retreat, drawing the Swedes deeper into the endless expanses of forests and marshes, while the supply lines stretched thin. By the spring of 1709, Charles's grand invasion had withered into a desperate struggle for survival. His army, once 40,000 strong, was now less than half that. Many had perished from the cold and hunger during the winter retreat from the upper Volga. The Swedish king himself was wounded, his foot completely destroyed by a musket, and was forced to direct operations from a stretcher. Seeking refuge and supplies, the Swedes turned south into Ukraine, where they hoped to link up with a Cossack hetman, Ivan Mazepa, who had rebelled against Russian rule. But Mazepa's promised reinforcements were not so much what he promised, and his own fortress had been destroyed by Peter's forces in what ended in a massacre. The Swedes' only hope now was to seize a fortified town that could serve as a base, and Poltava was it. Poltava wasn't much. It was on the Vorskla River, but its position was strategically important. It guarded the entrance to the Dnieper and the grain-rich lands beyond. The Russian garrison under Colonel Alexei Kellen had about 4,000 men and was well supplied with artillery. In October of 1708, Charles' army began the siege, but he was lacking heavy guns and engineering materials, and the Swedes relied on the basic old starvation and bombardment. But their efforts were slow and really kind of ineffective. Meanwhile, Tsar Peter assembled a massive relief force, more than 40,000 regular troops, with double that of auxiliaries, and advanced steadily from the north. By June 1709, Peter's army was encamped only a few miles away, across the Vorskla River, and inside the Swedish camp, morale was strained, but discipline pretty good. Charles XII, even though he was still confined to a stretcher, seemed pretty determined and calm, and his army had been victorious for years, notwithstanding the retreat from the Russian winter. His generals weren't feeling it, though. Supplies were gone. Men barely had enough rations. They were eating their horses and basic black bread. Powder was in bad shape. The muskets were rusty. But they thought maybe they would do it one more time, be able to pull a victory out, trusting to their experience. Peter the Great, as he was now known, encamped along the riverbank, was not going to let victory slip out of his hands. From the previous years, he had transformed his army from kind of a ragged feudal mob into a disciplined, pretty modern fighting force. Western officers trained his soldiers in the latest of tactics, his artillery was solid, and his logistic organization was just as good as anyone else's. He had built small fortified positions across the steppe north of Poltava, forming his defensive line should the Swedes try a spoiling attack. People understood that Charles's army, though brave, was weak and desperate. Time and numbers favored Russia. So at dawn on June 27th, the Swedish army formed for battle. The morning was clear and warm. The troops lined up in the familiar order, infantry in tight ranks at the center, cavalry on the flanks. General Carl Gustaf Renskold commanded in Charles' stead, since Charles was still confined to bed, and the king watched from his litter. The plan was simple but bold. Well, we're going to break through the Russian defenses before Peter could fully deploy his army, then strike the main camp near the river. A swift, concentrated attack they thought might smash the Russians before the numerical advantage could tell. It was a desperate ploy, and probably the only one they had. So around 4 a.m., Swedish drums started rolling and the blue ranks surged forward through the tall grass, bayonets fixed. And ahead, the Russian defenses loomed, bristling with cannon. The first volleys just tore through the Swedish lines, cutting down dozens. But they were veterans and they pressed on, and they managed to storm the outer redoubts by bayonet point. And for a moment, it seemed the plan might succeed. Russian gunners fled and cut down at their post as Swedish grenadiers poured into the defenses. But then the chaos soon took hold. The terrain between the redoubts was broken and smoky, the fog of war, and units lost contact in the chaos. Some Swedish regiments veered off course, and others stopped to capture the guns. The cavalry, which was supposed to pass through and outflank the Russians, became entangled among the fortifications and lost all semblance of unit cohesion. And most importantly, Renskold decided not to wait for all the redoubts to be taken before pushing forward. And that left pockets of Russian troops behind the Swedish front lines. And then they were firing into the rear. Meanwhile, Tsar Peter's main force was forming in open ground beyond the redoubt line, unleashing a storm of canister, cannonball, and grape shot that just destroyed the oncoming Swedes. The Russians, drilled in European fashion, held firm in their deep ranks, and their muskets were fired in disciplined volleys. And at the center stood the elite guards, regiments Peter himself had trained since boyhood. Against this wall of fire, the Swedish attack began to falter. Around 6 a.m., the Swedes finally broke through the redoubt line and reached the plain between the fortifications and the Russian camp. Their numbers were now barely 7,000, when most of this cavalry were still trying to get back to them. Renskold formed them into 2 attack columns and yet again ordered a direct assault on the Russian line. Yeah, the drums beat hard again and the blue ranks marched forward, and one more time they went into the teeth of the enemy's artillery. Peter, mounted on a tall horse, watched calmly from the Russian left. He wore his uniform and held a musket in his hand, sharing the dangers of his men. "Now, brothers," he reportedly said, "we shall see who are true warriors." And the cannons replied. The battlefield was soon obscured by smoke as the two armies closed to musket range. Swedish volleys cracked out in disciplined unison, followed by the rhythmic drumbeat of advance. They closed to within 50 paces before firing their first volley. The first Russian ranks wavered, and for a brief instant, yet again, it seemed the old Swedish magic might prevail. Then the Russian guards counterattacked. Reinforced by cavalry on the flanks, they poured a devastating volley into the Swedish columns and followed it with a bayonet charge. And the impact was overwhelming. Exhausted, outnumbered, and with no artillery support, the Swedes crumbled. Renskold tried to rally them, but it was gone. The discipline was broken, and the psychological impact of Peter's forces was just too much. The Swedish cavalry arrived too late and was driven back by Russian horsemen. The field became a scene of slaughter. Men fighting hand to hand, but mostly fleeing troops being chopped down from behind by the cavalry and by musket fire. By mid-morning, the battle was lost. Charles XII, still in his litter, however, refused to flee, urging his men to fight on until he himself was nearly captured by advancing Russians. His personal guard dragging him away while under fire, retreating south towards his camp. About 9 a.m., the remaining Swedish infantry, barely 1,500 men, formed a final square near a small ravine. Surrounded and just blasted by cannon, they fought stubbornly until Renskold gave the order to surrender. The Russian drums beat victory, and Tsar Peter rode among the prisoners, greeting his captives with a mixture of triumph and respect. To Renskold he said, "You did your duty bravely. The fortune of war has decided otherwise." For the Swedes, it was practically annihilation. Of roughly 17,000 men, More than 6,000 were killed and 2,800 captured. Another 14,000 who had remained in the camp surrendered later that day. Only a few thousand managed to escape south with Charles, crossing the Dnieper at a town I'm not even going to try to pronounce, before being pursued by Russian cavalry. From there, Charles fled into Ottoman territory, seeking asylum at Bender in Moldavia. The dream of Swedish Empire dominating the East had ended on the battlefield. For Peter the Great, Poltava was more than a victory. It was a vindication of his entire reign. He had proved that Russia could defeat the most feared military power in Europe, not by luck or numbers alone, but training, discipline, and modern organization. In the aftermath, he reportedly declared, "The foundation of St. Petersburg has been laid by this victory." And indeed, Poltava marked Russia's emergence as a major European power. It secured the Baltic for Peter and opened the path for the Treaty of Nystad in 1721, which would end the Great Northern War with Russia as Sweden's successor in the north. The battle's significance extended far beyond the immediate military result. It was the end of the Swedish age of greatness. Gustavus Adolphus and Charles XII had dominated the continent. Sweden's resources, drained by years of war, never recovered from the loss. The survivors who returned home years later, emaciated, broken men, finally released from Russian captivity, found a kingdom diminished and introspective. The age of Swedish conquest gave way to an era of neutrality and caution. And for Russia, the transformation was profound. Peter used the victory to solidify his reforms and to present himself as the enlightened monarch of a new Europeanized state. Foreign observers, ambassadors, and mercenaries who witnessed the battle sent dispatches across Europe proclaiming the birth of a new power. Russia was no longer the lumbering giant of the East, but a disciplined empire capable of shaping European politics. The battlefield itself became legend. Accounts describe the plain littered with corpses, the grass torched by cannon fire, and the air thick with the stench of powder. Russian engineers soon erected a triumphal obelisk on the site, while Peter ordered that the fallen Swedes be buried with honor. Yet the memory of the battle remained bitter. For Swedish officers in exile, Poltava was a wound that never healed. Charles XII, though defeated, refused to acknowledge final defeat. From his exile in Ottoman territory, he plotted. He even persuaded the Sultan to declare war on Russia, leading to the brief Russo-Turkish conflict of 1711. When he finally returned to Sweden in 1715, he found his kingdom exhausted and under blockade. 4 years later, he was killed at the siege of Fredriksten in Norway. The battle also revealed the stark contrast between the two monarchs who dominated the war. Charles XII embodied the old warrior king ideal. Peter the Great represented the modern autocrat, systematic, pragmatic, and guided by reason and reform. The Battle of Poltava remains one of the pivotal moments in European history, a turning point as decisive as Blenheim or Waterloo, all of which are part of the 15 decisive battles by Crecy, and marked the end of Swedish era of dominance and the birth of the Russian Empire. Beyond the historical sweep, of course, there was the human tragedy. Tens of thousands of men all died during the fighting. The Ukrainian lands through which the armies marched were devastated. Towns burned, fields stripped bare. And Ivan Mazeppa, whose bid for independence had tied his fate to Charles XII, died in exile soon after the battle. So what are some of the lessons learned? Well, the battle itself kind of shows where you're stuck at in a siege. If you don't have superior artillery or men, you're stuck with starvation. And that requires a lot of time. When you have a rampaging giant army that you have not dealt with, a siege of a town dependent upon starvation and time, which is going to take several months at a minimum, and sometimes can take years, just isn't going to work. And then you have the lesson of Russia and the culminating point. Army after army after army invaded Russia, and they will invariably culminate. Russia is 12 time zones. It is simply too vast. As long as a Russian commander does not stand and waste every remaining soldier against a superior army in the initial parts of the war, the scorched earth, retreat, and wait for the winter is a tried and true tactic that has never failed the Russian people. So stick with it. When you invade a country as vast as Russia, you will culminate. And depending upon the stupidity of your opponent is a bad strategy, whether it's in chess or whether it's in war. And we will see this again and again with Napoleon and with Hitler, where they invade and they make great strides, and the endless Russian terrain just gobbles up all their men and resources, and then Marshal Winter comes and destroys what's left. It happened to Sweden. It happened to Germany. It happened to Napoleon. It is the lesson of war in Russia. So, pro tip, don't invade Russia. All right, that's all I got, folks. Talk to you later. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.